This is the Tapped In Podcast, the podcast for beverage distributors that want to empower their sales team to drive business results. Listen up and welcome back to another episode of the Tapped In Sales. You're here with Bud. I'm your host, also with Mikey. And we have a special guest today, one of the smartest people in beer, Jennifer Hauke, founder of Draftline Technologies. Ms. Jen, how are you today?
Great. I've never been introduced as one of the smartest people in beer. It's scary, but I think it might actually be true.
It is actually true. What'll be fun is that you might be with two of the dumbest guys in beer, depending on who you talk to. So you'll hopefully will balance us out, raise the element in the education of the Tapped In Sales Podcast, and we'll see where this goes. And like we were talking about earlier, we usually don't do a big outline for the podcast and get everybody all ready. But for you, we sucked you in with a level of confidence with a whole outline. And now we're not going to do anything that we talked about. We're just going to do whatever the hell we want, just like what we want to.
It's meaningless. Close it.
Perfect.
Yes.
Hey, listen, as long as there's a margarita at the end or a beer at the end, I'm ready. I'm ready.
Well, that's a funny story because the first time that Jen and I met, it was, I think, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And it was like, well, we've met before, but it was like, hey, because we're part of the Winter Park, Florida Mafia, beverage tech mafia. So we both live in the same town in Winter Park, Florida. And he was like, hey, let's go have dinner together. And Jen and Drew, her husband, work together. It's like, well, I'm going to bring Drew. Okay, well, I'll bring Sarah. And we go to like a Wednesday lunch. It's like the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I think. It's the week of Thanksgiving. And we sit down.
It became infamous. You
two have already had a margarita. And it's like, okay, fuck it. I mean, why not? We'll have a margarita. So then I proceeded to have 4. We finally conned Sarah into having a margarita too. Drew was like, we ordered like our 3rd round and it was like another round. And the server was like, just 3? And he's like, no, make it 4.
Sarah had no choice.
She didn't. So immediate chaos ensued right away. Loved working with you ever since. We had a blast at that first lunch together. So Jen, thanks for joining us today. So for the crew listening, Jennifer Hauke is the founder of Draftline Technologies. There's a whole bunch that goes into that. So I want to actually have Jen, I want you to fully introduce yourself and kind of kick off the conversation around what Draftline does, how you came into the industry, where you started, where you're at now, and all that good stuff.
Okay, wow. So it's really almost 50 years of history, right? So in 2002, my husband and I started a chemical company that manufactures the micromatic chemical products. And that became the market leader. And then a number of years after that, I would say about 20, I think I had an inkling of the idea in 2009, but by 2015, we had put together a mobile application because I knew that people weren't using as much chemical as they should when they were going in and cleaning. And I had a sneaking suspicion that the lines and the accounts were not getting visited as often as they should. So for anybody who does not know, all the major breweries in the US and the Brewers Association guidelines say that you have to clean the lines every 2 weeks. And what that does is make the beer taste good. Okay. It's almost, I equate it to like washing your dishes after dinner. You've got to make sure that everything's clean. And what happened was I didn't realize the need that was out there to have a simple to use program that ensured that the technicians were able to plug into the routes and the schedules that they should be adhering to. And so to back up a little bit, I grew up in a family business in Detroit, and my dad had over 3,000 line cleaning accounts that I was running off of Excel. And, I was doing this through high school, through college. Of course, my husband and I leave Detroit for Florida and started the chemical company. And that need, I could see through that with working with our chemical customers. And everybody said it was pretty much the dumbest idea they had ever heard, to come up with a mobile application that was catering to technicians with the cloud support team and all that kind of stuff. But it took off like wildfire. So we estimate that there are 1.5 million draft lines in the US, maybe 1.6. Nobody can tell me I'm wrong. Maybe there's a viewer out there today that has some insight that I haven't been able to find. And so we're now managing cleaning on over 1 million lines across the US. So I, again, stepped back and said, holy crap, like, I can't believe that happened. And the programmers were telling me, Jen, I don't think you realize how many records you have because we have to track the brands. And for anybody, again, who doesn't know, there's no scan codes on beer kegs. So you can't identify, what's coming and going. It literally is a guy walks into a bar, or a gal, because we love our lady line cleaners, and they are, manually inputting that information, which had never really happened before in mass. And so that's where I came up with the idea for Draftline data, because I love the industry. I was just back in Detroit a couple weekends ago, Bud, with all my family. And I don't know if you saw that on LinkedIn.
Back in the north.
Back in the north. And I said, no service calls were getting done that Saturday night, let me tell you, because we were having such a good time. But, I think the reason I stuck with it is because it was everybody I was related to, all my friends are technicians. I knew how smart they were. And I was going to bet on that person to make sure that we could do something meaningful within draft. So it's now morphed into making sure that the technicians have the best in class experience that we can provide, the best in class products at the locations that we serve. And then also taking, I guess you would call it metadata, right? It's all this data that they're able to collect that lends itself, that data collection process lends itself to the technician when they're in there, because there's a little bit of a lull in the action that's kind of the perfect time for them to take this TAP survey. And so that now has morphed into what we call Draftline data, and that is helping distributors take a look at the competitive market that they're playing in, looking at not only their information and where they sit, but also where they could mine opportunities that are brought in by those technicians. And so I think it's the biggest game changer yet, which sounds weird because I'm in a really narrow lane, guys. I always say it's 5/16, which is about the size of a beer tube for anybody that doesn't know. So it's weird that you could do so many things in one very specific area, but it's a heck of a lot of fun. And we really love the people we work with.
Mikey, what's the resistance on a 3-foot short draw on a 5/16 line?
5/16. I don't know if I've ever used 5/16 on the beer side. Usually
3/8.
3/16. Yeah. 3/8 the jumper.
Yeah.
But it depends on what reference you're going after, because I believe Miller Coors says it's 2.5, AB says it's 3, or a pound. That's what it was.
I am impressed. Well, that's your gas pressure for sure. Yes. And listen, let me tell you, some of that's all over.
I love
all
it. So
over the
Mikey,
board.
I think 2.5
Mikey,
for Miller, 3 for AB.
There we go. So Mikey and I have both been to draft school. He had a completely different experience than I did. He actually learned stuff. I got overserved the day before the test. It was not my fault. I got completely overserved. We show back up, and we're going through the quality testing part. And I take
I love
one
that they
whiff
do the
of
quality
this.
testing 7 a.m.
Yes.
Day two of the training.
Right.
You just met everybody. You went out and partied. Yeah, they did.
Yeah. See, I was overserved. It's not my fault. And I get the whiff of the diacetyl, and I have an acute sense. Like, I have a very acute sense of diacetyl. For whatever reason, they're like, you really know when you taste diacetyl. I'm like, I looked at the guy who was my partner and was like, I'm not fucking drinking that. There's no way I'm drinking that.
It gives you a headache.
Oh, yeah.
So the
sure.
bacteria that's left over in draft beer, nothing will hurt you, but it can give you a bellyache, it can give you a headache, and that kind of relates to that chart that we can either look at now or later, Bud. But
well, let's talk about that for a minute. So, because that was where I was going too, Jen, with the story of like the reason why this started from a
Yeah.
business is about cleanliness, and we'll kind of
Yeah.
make a quick pit stop on category health for a hot minute. So cleanliness and category health, plus or minus the industry total volume from a volumetric side, about 14 to 16% of the business, depending on the market you're in.
Hmm.
Nationally, it's probably leaning more towards the 14%. Pre-COVID, it was probably closer to the 16%, is running through the on-premise. And then
Hmm.
there's a huge segment of that, which is through draft sales.
Right.
And if the category wants to present itself with the best foot forward and with the highest standards, which from a marketing perspective, what does wine do? Wine talks exclusively about its quality and how fancy it is and how French it
Right.
is and all that bullshit. And then you've got spirits, and everything about spirits is incredibly aspirational from a marketing perspective. They do a great job of finding those celebrities and partners to make it aspirational, clean and
Right.
fresh and all this stuff. And beer is, like, frankly, from a cleanliness perspective, Jen, an afterthought for most retailers, right? And
Well, I think the problem is that we have so far to go in the education part.
okay.
Okay, so and let's back up a little bit. And I love this chart. This is on the Brewers Association website. This is the Draft Beer Quality Manual. The reason for everything that I do is basically this chart, which shows the growth of bacteria within a beer line. Okay, and so the reason why we clean on a 14-day cycle, which you see there in the middle, is because you go in and do everything right on day one. The bacteria count starts to grow, and you see it spike between days 3 and 7. So when you were talking about the tasting and the off flavors that they teach you to recognize within draft class, for example, at Anheuser-Busch, they spike the drinks with different bacteria that is present within a beer line. And so beer should be presented where it smells good, it tastes good, and that's just a reflection of a well-maintained system. And so, from a category perspective, one of the reasons why I think we have such a tough go is because what we do is hard work. It's not easy. You have to show up, okay? And so, asking beer wholesalers in I believe it's the 37 states where they're responsible for line cleaning, it's an expense. They have to provide this service to their customers for free. So they're going into the accounts, cleaning for those accounts and providing that service. In other states like Michigan, which I always say south of the Mason-Dixon line is pretty much wholesaler responsibility. In the Midwest, a little bit in the Pacific Northwest, and a little bit in the Northeast states like New York. They always get pounded on with draft quality because that's retailer responsibility. But one of the reasons why I love to do a podcast is because people are like, what is it that you do? They don't know that this even happens. And so in the US, we have non pasteurized beer. And so
Mhm.
with that, you have more bacteria in the beer. And so you have to go out on a regular cycle to make sure that you're cleaning. And there are products like our Micromatic beer line cleaner that are validated and vetted by every brewery out there. And you're supposed to use those at very specific concentrations. And that takes your bacteria count back down to 0.
Yeah.
And so this is the genesis for all the different steps that we take with the technicians, and also the reason why we're able to create and collect such data through that user profile. And even now, with everything trending towards e-commerce platforms, you know, less and less sales reps are going out. So we call it the service lane as the sales lane, because everyone loves their technicians typically when they come in to clean because they're solving problems for that retailer. They're making the beer taste better. I've done so many on sites with technicians over the year. They get hugs when they show up. Tell me one salesman that gets that when they walk in. So everybody really um, relies on the technician, but unfortunately, we don't always give them the number of resources that they need to be able to carry out their job as easily. And I think that's the thing that I haven't talked about a lot with Draftline Bud is, the mobile application is very reasonable. But it is an expense to our wholesalers or our third-party companies that use it. But really the first payback is the efficiency that you get
Yeah.
from your team. because you have this fixed cost that you're spending on a crew to go out and clean, whether it's in-house through a distributor or if you're hiring a third party to go out and do it. And so we see anywhere from a 65% improvement, as low as like a 20% improvement. They're not paying any more, but they're getting more results out of the crew. Does that make sense? And that's simply they're getting to more accounts, cleaning more efficiently. They have better ways that they're able to see the data and send that ultimately back up to their suppliers.
So from an efficiency standpoint, like the way I position this with some clients that we jointly work with and with some other people that we've talked about working together on is that, like, Jen, in your background where you ran and your family ran an independent line cleaning company that had to be profitable, like, you got to make money.
Oh yeah. I mean, if we didn't get the lines cleaned, there was no money coming in.
You kind of had to. Yeah. So,
Yes.
your background comes from running an independent line cleaning company where you have to be profitable and service the customers, and moving into this realm where your core consumer or core client base is a beer distributor who this is a cost center rather than it's definitely not a profit center. It's a cost center. So the real outcome is here. How do we raise of Draftline Technologies? How do we raise the efficiencies to actually lower the cost per line or line servicing? So that's the kind of entry level point. So tell us more a little bit. I'm going to actually bounce over to one of the slides. Like, tell us what a visit looks like for one of those line cleaners that are actually going out into the trade and working with using the technicians. So they're showing up, they're doing all the cleaning. Walk us through that process real quick.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very repetitive. Okay, so we have a lot of people that like to do the same things every day and follow a certain set of steps. So you're typically going to have between 8 and 12 accounts, sometimes a little bit less, that you're going into on a daily basis on your route. And so those would line up before you. And you start out, I like to see them start really early in the day. COVID changed a little bit of that because the chain accounts you can't get into as early as you once had because there's just not staff there at that point. And they carry around either large recirculation pumps, which is the best way to clean. It's 80% more effective, all things being equal with your time and your chemical dosage. But typically, I would say 97% of the market actually uses what we call cleaning canisters. So it's those large silver canisters with couplers on the top. So they dose the chemical, they carry in their cans, they have their brushes, they have their wrenches, they go in, they get the chemical pumping through the lines. So they take the couplers off the beer, pop those on the canisters, get that dosed. The best practice, and for that link that we had up previously, will walk you through the entire process, start to finish, on long draw systems, short draw systems. The best practice is that if you are using static cleaning, which is the canister, because we have two types of processes in the US, static and recirc. If you're using a canister, you should let the chemical soak for 20 minutes. That does not happen as often as it should. And it's not always the fault of the technician because they'll go into the accounts, and if I had $1 for every time I heard, Jen, I went in, they said, hey man, can you be done in 10 minutes? I said, yeah, because I'm trying to make them happy, So I always tell the technicians, we're going to shoot for the moon and hopefully land among the stars. We want to make sure that we have as much contact time as possible. Should be 20 minutes. And if you're recircing, it should be 15 minutes. During that process, they should be taking apart the faucets. And there's a lot of little nooks and crannies for things to grow behind those. And we're not going to show photos of those today, but I have some interesting ones that people have sent me this week. And so you break those apart, you soak those just in a bucket or in a sink with the chemical, brush them. While you're waiting for that soak process to finish up, that's where you're taking your survey information and entering the other details that are specific to the line cleaning process itself, which we have to report back to the suppliers, and any other details, photos, those types of things we're asking the technicians to enter. They then put everything back together, wipe it down, make sure it looks beautiful, and then they're off to the next account.
So when
So
you gather that data, right, when they're in there and they're doing their surveys, where does that data then go, and who gets it, and how do they read it?
So basically, in the early days when it was just Draftline Technician, it was going mostly to the draft manager. And so the draft manager is looking at what accounts am I servicing at what level, if that makes sense. So always your top accounts, you want to make sure that you're out there regularly. And then if the routes are set up appropriately, you don't have too many problems. But in what we call our startup phase, there's a lot of rerouting typically because it's not just shooting, addresses into a mapping program because you're dealing with hours of operation and a lot of other logistics. In Draftline, we also track the beer system. So from the cooling unit to the stations to the towers to the faucets. Now the brands, the distributors, the breweries on those faucets, and a whole lot of other styles and things like that. So the data had never been collected in that way before, and the reason why I did that, coming from the technician perspective, if I'm picking up somebody's route and I haven't been to that account before, I want to see exactly where I need to go and what I need to do. Okay. And so it's very different than a regular survey program because you can also monitor faucet position, what brands are churning off of which faucet, and location. And so initially, the data was going to the draft managers and anybody in charge of that on-premise team to make sure the quality was where it was supposed to be. And we have a number of exports that are specific to different suppliers: Molson Coors, Anheuser-Busch, New Belgium. Those are kind of the big three, maybe Diageo and Sierra Nevada as well, that would require what we call compliance reporting every year, because within the equity agreements, the beer wholesalers have to prove that they're carrying out this process if they're in those states where they're responsible. So a lot of reporting and data goes that direction. Then with the brand information, that kind of came later. We started working on that about 3 years ago. And that's really where we kind of crossed over from dealing with just the draft department to now the sales department. Because over that period in time, COVID hit, less sales reps were going into accounts because of e-commerce platforms. And they're like, wait, I can get this data here. And I have somebody who can do an actual on-site validation, take a photo, see if the information's correct. And so that information is going to not only the on-premise sales team, general managers, and owners to take a look at where their market share is sitting at. So it's been
Yeah,
different for sure.
so they can actually get in, kind of see brands on tap in their market. I mean, that's super valuable and super useful, especially my former life being a brand manager and our team leader. It would be a little frustrating walking into an account and saying they don't even have an IPA on tap. And right now IPA
Right.
is our number one style in the market, and we're missing this out here. Or walking into an account maybe to have lunch twice in 1 month, and there's still an open line. And it's like, all right, who's not happy?
Yes.
What's going on with that? So to have that market level data is super valuable, especially. I mean, we always kind of went after the perfect draft lineup, right? There was nothing more that frustrated me more than walking into a bar that had 4 or 5 taps, right? And it was Bud Light, Ultra, Miller Lite, Coors Light. And I'm like, hey, you guys are missing something here, and there's always that excuse. Hey, well, Bob drinks Miller Lite.
Yeah.
Sandy likes Coors Light. And my customers like these. Well, hey, guess what? If we can kind of narrow these down a little bit and keep a couple light beers. So how do you, when you get that data, I mean, how do you use that to kind of go out and target maybe vulnerable accounts that, hey, we have some
Yeah.
bigger opportunity here, or hey, maybe IPA was doing really, really good, the competitor tap on this in this account. They've
Yeah.
removed IPA to put on their summer seasonal, and now we have an opportunity to grab. How would you use the data to kind of grab that?
So that is a great question. And that is the hardest thing to do because typically I don't know any wholesalers aside from the ones that we work with that are doing that today. Because a lot of wholesalers don't even know what the competitive market looks like for them. I talked to a couple of guys a few months ago and I said, well, what type of market share do you think you guys have? And they said, oh, we're at 70%. And when I went in and looked, and keep in mind, this is based off of total tap handles in the market, so it's not their volume, they were at 27%.
Oh
And
wow!
so there is And I also, because wholesalers in a lot of ways are not used to looking at competitive on-premise data, they think that we're taking information from their competitors and popping it into their database. And I'm like, no, this is what your team tracked. This is your data. We're looking at it, at the whole market. And I think that's where that system builder that I talked about really comes into play, because you can take that, you can look at the movement on the tower. One of the things I became famous for in the early days, famous in draft, right? We have a tiny world, obviously, but it was open lines, tracking where there is nothing. And so before COVID, we had about 44,000. We had less lines that we were tracking then. We now have right around 100,000 open lines in the market. And so I love open lines. In the words of Dave Matthews, the space between where there's nothing, right? You don't even have to knock off a competitor, Mikey, to place a brand on an open line. You just got to clean it
So
and
easy.
pop something new on. It's so easy. And so it takes a lot of different directions. What's also been really interesting for me is, I'm a huge fan of reading all the daily publications, Beer Business Daily, Brewbound. There's some other writers within the space that have come up recently that are pretty amazing. But what I have found and what my team has found is that the national numbers really don't mean a lot to a distributor in their particular territory. What matters for them is what their brand portfolio is. And hopefully they've been nurturing that over time. So they've got some really good craft beers, and then what they do with it, and also what their competitors are. So it's kind of fun because it's a little bit of a puzzle when you go in, because every distributor has known brand advantages. And Bud, I'm sure you know all about this. You've got your hot brands, and for every top 10 list, I was dissecting the San Diego market this week. You have like 5 true national brands, and you also have 5 regional or hyper local brands that fall within that top 10. So we also tell our wholesalers that we work with and our sales teams, you should never be rotating out your top 10 brands. Those should always be there forever. But what it all, and we'll talk about this in a second, what it all rolls up to, Mikey, is that you've got to create the perfect tower for each account. And you also have to be okay with there's going to be some competitive brands on there to be able to craft a really great draft experience, and just like this beer tower that's on fire, and creating excitement about it, And rotation is okay if it is controlled. So this is an interesting one, Bud, that I think we should talk about. Single faucet brands. Every single market has a very long list of brands where they're on just one tap in the market. So in San Diego, and this isn't a particular distributor, this is San Diego overall. We track the vast majority of the market through one of our third-party companies. And so 905 brands appear on only one tap or one faucet in that market. Over the previous, it wasn't 12 months, I think it was only like 6 months, there were 1,007 brands that were on tap that are now gone. And so what does that tell you? I had this idea with the data that there's a cost to every time you're rotating something out. Every time a brand goes on and every time a brand leaves, there's a cost, okay? And
the
I
tap
came
handle
up with,
alone usually accounts for your profit.
that's right. So basically, it's the tap handle, it's anything in your decision window, merchandising. I always say the man in the van. It's the person in the van that shows up, delivering the beer, the person cleaning. And draft is so fun for me because it's very dynamic. There's a lot going on with draft. You're not dropping off cases, and you've got to nurture this, right? Well, so if you are placing brands on one faucet, it's perhaps the worst thing you could possibly do. Everybody wants uniqueness, but you've got to have products on that draft tower that are moving volume. And so we talk about overproliferation of brands. This is a great example. It happens in every single market. We shouldn't have brands on draft that are just on one tap.
So the piece of that, Jen, around single faucet is I think about, from our running our wholesaler was we didn't want a single car on the lot from like a car dealer's
Yes.
perspective. We wanted multiple on the lot because that was a scale game. And if we didn't have a scale game, like nobody thinks about, some wholesalers do, but very few wholesalers think
Very
about
few.
there's an administrative expense to add a new product to the list
Yes.
in the product database. You've got administrative side, then you got to price the thing, then you got to bring it in, which means you got to house it and you got to warehouse it, and then you actually got to get it out the door and sell it. And for the states and wholesalers that actually contribute to the line cleaning, then you got a cost of line cleaning as well. So I liken it to this quote that I've said on the podcast a couple of times. Like, are we creating activity for activity's sake? Or
Right.
are we driving profit to the bottom line in our operations? And those single faucets are not driving profitability to the bottom line. When you really put all the steps and did a cost analysis for all the steps, it's no different than taking a seasonal and a 50, Mikey, there's 56 cases on a pallet of beer if it's 4 612s, right?
Bottles, yeah, good.
Models. So we
Good.
take 56 cases, and if we sampled out 2 cases, sold the rest of the pallet, and then brought back 5 cases in out of date, we cut our profitability in that pallet of beer by half. So are we generating activity for activity's sake, or are we driving profitability to the bottom line? And you do a really nice job of talking about that. So there's for your smartest wholesalers out there, they're working with you, any other things that they're doing outside of single lines that are helping them drive profitability to their bottom line as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we call Draftline like the opportunity finder. And so we're diving into the database. And this goes back to Mikey's question too. Like, what are you doing, right, to help? Pulling up where their number one brand is not pouring and their number one competitor is. And slicing that out to each sales rep saying, here's your opportunity list, here's your opportunity list. And what happens when you do that is you may have a handful of chain accounts on that list where you can't have impact because they're locked in. But there's 10 or 15 other places where they're like, oh my God, I can't believe that they're not pouring this particular product. So it is a game of lining up opportunities and seeing how many they can take advantage of. Now, when you start to do that, especially when you haven't been doing it previously for the on-premise, you got to go slow. You got to pick an easy target, open lines. You pick 1 or 2 or 3 beers and you go after those open lines. You got to make sure it's sort of like we talk about mouth feel and draft. You got to go with your gut feel to make sure that they have it and that you're coaching them and that you're following up on that very regularly with them so they understand what the objectives are. And you're then monitoring and measuring. You're also directing those sales reps to not cause churn. Okay, we have a massive problem the way incentives are created in this country for
You don't say, Jen.
incentivizing activity for activity's sake, and it is not meaningful. Okay, and so that is the other differentiator with it. Started out with that simple technician app. You can see exactly where that's going. You can see where those brands are moving to. You can see if it left the location, and you're constantly coaching the sales team. They don't like it necessarily if they're not bought in right away, but and this is not my area of expertise, this would be more your area. You've got to make sure that you create those incentive programs to match the results that you want to see in draft.
Yeah.
And it can be transformational. We have one wholesaler that we work with together. They're up 17.5% on volume. And that, I would say, was a 4-year project. They knew that they had to get the quality program where they wanted it to be. They knew that there were certain key positions they had to hire for, and they have killed it the last year. Absolutely killed it. And so that's the other great thing about Draftline. I actually get goosebumps thinking about it because we're able to connect people in draft. I always get questions from draft managers. How do other people do it, Jen? because there's no union for draft managers. There's no trade organization, right? They basically have Draftline. And so they're like, oh, and I can bring those best practices together for the companies that we work for. Well, we're doing that with the sales teams too. And, I worked in a family business for a long time.
Hmm.
Many beer wholesalers are family businesses, and you're doing things just because that's the way you always did it. It doesn't mean that that's actually the best way to execute, right?
And the market's changed so much. So if we go back to like the 90s, and draft beer was always a player, but it was not the complexity that it is now in terms of number of faucets, because there wasn't the availability of the brands to fill those faucets. So you probably, I would say, if we had this access to this data in terms of number of lines, it'd probably be half as
I
what it
have
is
that.
today.
I have a
What is
great
it?
chart on that. Do you want me to send it to you?
Well, we could follow up with it, and we were going to
Yeah.
do more than
I'd love
these.
to
You'll
see
let
that
me
too.
armchair expert it from here. But
Yeah.
what actually is it? Do you remember
Okay.
off the top of your head from the mid
One,
'90s to today?
well, my wave starts in 1982 when Ken Grossman brewed his first beer in Sierra
Yeah.
Nevada, in which, by the way, my first customer was in Chico, California. And it was the biggest, toughest guy, my husband, because everybody told me my idea was dumb. And they said, if you can make it work with this guy, you can make it work anywhere. So, and my dad being a cranky little Lebanese man, I was used to working with tough guys. So Ken Grossman brews his first beer in 1982. There's also later on the introduction of the slim keg or the sixth barrel.
Yeah.
And what happened was our refrigerators did not get bigger,
Nope.
but the kegs got smaller. And now we have Bud Light and six barrels, which to me is a little bit sad. But we had a proliferation of lines. With that, you got a proliferation of brands because of the craft beer movement. So it was kind of the confluence of all these different factors: craft beer, slim kegs, and that just taking off. So we started at about 400,000 lines in the 80s. And also in the late 70s, I think the year after I was born, there were like 300 and some breweries in the US. We now have, 50 years later, we have licenses for over 10,000 breweries. And so on Draftline, we track, it's something like over 80,000 brands.
Hmm.
Nobody tracks at that level of detail. And we have applied styles and categories to about 18, 20,000 of those. Some of them, if they're just on one faucet, I had to draw the line somewhere. We're not applying styles to those, but it's this long tail that is absolutely unbelievable. But I think too, the long tail is made up of a lot of craft. But I will tell you, when I look in craft, everybody's like, oh, this isn't doing well. There are superstars in that space on draft in any given market. And so that's where I say, okay, even if the overall trend isn't great, it's kind of like Sun Tzu in the Art of War. Like if they think you're attacking in the East, attack in the West. There is somebody in every market that is killing it from what I see. And so they're bucking the trend because they've just decided to get busy and
For
get
sure.
competitive. And so the total number of lines started about 400,000. Now we're at about 1.5 million.
Yep.
So you could say that the open lines at 90,000. And so we're tracking, we think, 2/3 of the market. Okay, we don't know. Nobody can tell me for sure. But I came up with that based off of the information I had from my mentor at Micromatic and how many systems they sell and have sold over the years, how many technicians we work with. And for the areas that I don't have a lot of coverage, I've worked with the wholesalers to see how many accounts they have. And we know on average that there's 8.9 faucets per account. So the math to me still holds. It always has come out to 1.5 million. So I talk about that as kind of like the last draft super cycle, where, and also interestingly enough, the major brewers, Mikey, are still at just about the same number of lines.
Wow.
So that increase has come with the craft phenomenon,
For
with the
sure.
slim keg, with all these other, and so you have this, ultimate fruit flavors that you can place on a beer tower. it's not necessarily that should be on a beer tower. And so I think the work that we're doing right now is probably with account classification. It's going to lead to, okay, what's the optimal draft tower for this particular account based on this set of inputs? That's
sure.
where we'll get to. Yeah.
It's the Lakeview Lounge, Mikey. It's no Southwest Michigan's #1 rated bartender, Norm Downey. He went
we spent what 6 or 7 years running around to accounts. We couldn't do the work ourselves, but we could walk into an account and go, oh man, you have this nice cooler with one faucet. You can easily get six barrels in here. Call this guy. You know, you talk to your draft tech to see what you can do. And really, we can expand. I mean, that was just the boom, right? Where everybody took their one or two faucet kegerator and jammed as many six as you can. Lakeview Lounge. I think he went from 4 taps to 20-some taps.
He's not at 20. He's like 12 or 15, isn't he?
I don't know, man. It's a lot. He has that whole back bar too.
Yeah, you're right.
Multiple faucets on it. So, I mean, it was just crazy. So, yeah, to hear those statistics is pretty wild. But you mentioned something too about the perfect lineup, and I know it's going to vary from account to account. But in your world, in the perfect account, what would that lineup look like style wise? Not so much brands, but style wise.
Well, I think you've got to have a mix. It goes back to the top 10. You've got to have your light lagers. I would always love to see a nitrogenated beer. I mean, I think Guinness should be everywhere. That one's so sticky as far as when it lands on a faucet, it almost never leaves. For those of you that don't know, you need a modification to your beer system for that. And I think that's just a great product to have on draft. I also, this being me, I love to see craft cocktails on a tower. And so I kind of love all the products. For your most popular craft cocktails, margaritas, Tito's, all of that lends itself to the speed of service that draft can provide in a market or in a location, right? So for me, it's probably a bigger mix than you would imagine. So I like to see kind of running the gamut. And so, like, for example, all those open lines out in the market, if every location that had that came up with another variety of beer, we got a lot of IPAs out there, or a cocktail that you're charging a whole bunch of money for, and you can serve it with a great speed of service, that's a great thing to do with those empty lines. So for me, I would probably have to ask Phil if it was true beer, what he would have on that tower. But for me, it's a mix of things that are serving the needs of the customers in that particular account. Drew and I go to a place in Winter Park, and they've got sangria on tap, and they're pouring that left and right, pitchers, this, that, glasses, and it's really quick and it's really yummy. And so, yeah, I like to see other beyond beer products on there too.
Well, Jen, if somebody wanted to hunt you down and work with you more closely, tell us where they can find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so basically my email's Jennifer@draftlinetechnologies.com. The website is draftlinetechnologies.com. Click that. My cell phone's on there. Dear God, I have thousands of people that have my cell phone, I know, but it's funny. And when they call, they're like, wait, are you the owner? Well, I guess so. Yeah. So they can find me pretty easily that way.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, Jen, thanks for joining us today. Incredible insights for the market and for the listeners. We will have you back. There are things that we didn't get to talk about today that we plan on talking about that we need to go deeper into for sure. But, we're going to do this hopefully on the regular for sure. Maybe next time we'll even do it at a bar with margaritas on tap.
Oh, dear God. Can you imagine? And we won't let anybody count how many of those we drink either.
Well, true. I mean, you could turn it into a drinking game. I'm sure there's something in there.
Perfect. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, guys. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.